Sarah Martinez had been wearing her military uniform with pride for 8 years. Every morning, she carefully pressed the crisp fabric, polished her boots until they gleamed, and pinned her medals in perfect alignment. The uniform represented everything she had worked for since joining the Army at 18 years old. On that Tuesday morning in September, Sarah walked into the military base cafeteria expecting another ordinary day. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air as soldiers lined up for breakfast. She grabbed her usual black coffee and found a seat near the window where sunlight streamed across the checkered floor. Colonel Henderson approached her table with heavy footsteps. His face carried an expression Sarah had never seen before. Behind him walked 2 other officers she didn't recognize. Their serious faces made her stomach tighten with worry. "Sergeant Martinez," Colonel Henderson said in a voice that seemed different from his usual friendly tone. "We need to speak with you immediately." Sarah stood up quickly, her coffee cup clattering against the saucer. Other soldiers in the cafeteria turned to look. She could feel their curious eyes watching as she followed the officers to a small meeting room down the hallway. The room felt cold, despite the warm September weather outside. Colonel Henderson closed the door with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence. The 2 unknown officers positioned themselves near the door, while the colonel sat across from Sarah at a metal table. "There has been a complaint filed against you," Colonel Henderson began, pulling out a manila folder. "Someone has reported that you have inappropriate markings on your body that violate military dress code regulations." Sarah's heart began racing. She thought about the tattoo on her back that she had gotten 5 years earlier. It was always covered by her uniform, and she had never shown it to anyone at the base. How could someone have seen it? "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What kind of complaint?" One of the unknown officers stepped forward. His name tag read Captain Morrison. "We have received information that you have a tattoo that contains inappropriate imagery that goes against military standards. We need to verify this complaint immediately." The room felt like it was spinning around Sarah. She had always been careful to keep her tattoo hidden. It was personal and meaningful to her, but she knew the military had strict rules about visible tattoos. However, hers was never visible while in uniform. "We are ordering you to remove your uniform shirt so we can inspect the reported tattoo," Colonel Henderson said, avoiding eye contact with Sarah. "This is a direct order." "Sergeant." Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment and confusion. She had never been asked to undress for an inspection before. The thought of removing her uniform in front of these men made her feel vulnerable and exposed. "Sir, with respect, I would prefer a female officer to be present for this inspection," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. Captain Morrison shook his head. "There are no female officers available at this time. This inspection needs to happen now. The complaint specifically mentioned inappropriate content that could affect your standing in the military." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to understand what was happening. She thought about her tattoo and wondered if someone had seen it accidentally, maybe in the locker room or during a medical examination. But she couldn't remember any recent situations where it would have been visible. The 3rd officer, whose name tag read Lieutenant Barnes, spoke for the first time. "Sergeant Martinez, this is a serious matter. If you refuse to comply with this order, it could result in disciplinary action against you." Sarah looked around the room at the 3 men staring at her expectantly. She felt trapped and confused. Her tattoo was meaningful to her, but she couldn't understand why it would cause such a serious reaction. It wasn't offensive or inappropriate in her opinion. "What exactly was reported about my tattoo?" Sarah asked, hoping to understand the situation better. Colonel Henderson opened the folder and read from a paper inside. "The complaint states that you have a tattoo containing imagery that promotes violence and goes against the peaceful values of our military." Sarah's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Her tattoo was nothing like what they were describing. She wondered if there had been some kind of mistake or if someone had made a false report about her. "Sir, I believe there may be a misunderstanding about my tattoo. It doesn't contain any violent imagery," Sarah explained. Captain Morrison crossed his arms. "That's exactly why we need to see it for ourselves. We cannot take your word alone when there has been an official complaint filed." Sarah realized she had no choice but to comply with their order. She slowly began unbuttoning her uniform shirt, her hands trembling slightly. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across the room as she prepared to reveal the tattoo that had apparently caused such controversy. As she removed her shirt, Sarah thought about the day she had gotten the tattoo. It had been during a difficult time in her life, and the tattoo represented something deeply personal and meaningful to her. She never imagined it would cause problems in her military career. The officers moved closer to examine her back where the tattoo was located. Sarah stood facing the wall, feeling exposed and uncomfortable as the three men studied the artwork on her skin. What happened next would change everything. Sarah thought she knew about her place in the military and the true nature of the complaint against her. The tattoo that someone had reported as inappropriate was about to reveal a truth that none of the officers in the room were prepared for. The silence in the room stretched on as the officers examined Sarah's back. She could hear their quiet breathing and the sound of papers rustling as they compared what they saw with the complaint in the folder. Sarah waited, wondering what their reaction would be and how this unexpected inspection would affect her military career that she had worked so hard to build. The silence in the room became unbearable as Sarah stood with her back exposed to the three officers. She could feel their eyes studying every detail of her tattoo, and she wondered what they were thinking. The complaint had described violent imagery, but Sarah knew her tattoo contained nothing of the sort. Captain Morrison was the first to break the silence. His voice came out as barely a whisper. "My God." Sarah heard Colonel Henderson's sharp intake of breath followed by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor as someone sat down heavily. Lieutenant Barnes made a choking sound like he was trying to swallow something that wouldn't go down. Sergeant Martinez. Colonel Henderson's voice was completely different now, filled with something Sarah couldn't identify. "Please put your shirt back on." Sarah quickly pulled her uniform shirt back over her shoulders, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. She turned around to face the officers and was shocked by what she saw. All three men had tears in their eyes. Captain Morrison was covering his mouth with his hand, and Lieutenant Barnes was staring at the floor. "I don't understand," Sarah said, looking from one officer to another. "What's wrong? Is there a problem with my tattoo?" Colonel Henderson closed the manila folder and pushed it aside. He rubbed his eyes and took several deep breaths before speaking. "Sergeant Martinez, the complaint we received was completely false. Whoever filed it either made a terrible mistake or deliberately lied about what your tattoo contains." Sarah felt relief wash over her, but she was still confused by the officers' emotional reactions. "Then why do you all look so upset? If the complaint was false, shouldn't we just dismiss it and move on?" Captain Morrison finally found his voice. "Sarah, what you have on your back isn't inappropriate at all. It's one of the most beautiful and meaningful tattoos any of us have ever seen." Sarah was even more confused now. She had always loved her tattoo, but she didn't understand why it would make three tough military officers cry. "I still don't understand what's happening here." Lieutenant Barnes looked up from the floor with red eyes. "Your tattoo shows the names and dates of fallen soldiers, doesn't it? Along with the image of a military cemetery." Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes, it's a memorial tattoo. It honors the members of my unit who died in Afghanistan during my first deployment. I got it after I returned home to remember them." Colonel Henderson's voice was thick with emotion. "How many names are on your back, Sergeant?" 43, Sarah answered quietly. 43 soldiers who didn't make it home. Each name is written in beautiful script with their birth and death dates. The cemetery image has 43 crosses, one for each of them." The room fell silent again as the impact of Sarah's words sank in. Captain Morrison walked to the window and stared outside. Lieutenant Barnes put his head in his hands. Colonel Henderson sat motionless, staring at the closed folder. "Sergeant Martinez," Colonel Henderson finally spoke, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Was your first deployment to Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan?" Sarah's eyes widened. "Yes, sir. How did you know that?" Captain Morrison turned away from the window with tears streaming down his face. "Because I was there too. I was the medical officer for that base." Sarah felt her legs go weak. She grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. "Captain Morrison, you were the medic who tried to save Lieutenant Rodriguez when the IED exploded?" Captain Morrison nodded, unable to speak. Sarah remembered that terrible day when her close friend Miguel Rodriguez had been killed by a roadside bomb. The medic had worked frantically to save him, covered in blood, and refusing to give up even when it was clear there was no hope. "And you're the soldier who carried wounded men to safety during the mortar attack," Lieutenant Barnes said, looking up at Sarah with new respect. "I was one of the men you saved that day." Sarah stared at Lieutenant Barnes, trying to remember his face from 5 years ago. Then it clicked. He had been a young private then, barely 19 years old, with a serious leg wound from shrapnel. She had dragged him to cover while explosions rocked the base around them. Colonel Henderson opened the folder again and pulled out the complaint form. "This complaint was filed by someone claiming your tattoo promotes violence and goes against military values. But what they described doesn't match what you actually have at all." Sarah sat down across from the colonel, her mind reeling from these unexpected connections. "Who filed the complaint?" "The name on the form is Sergeant David Walsh," Colonel Henderson read. "Do you know him?" Sarah's face hardened. "Yes, I know Walsh. He was also at FOB Chapman, but he was sent home early for disciplinary issues. He never got along with anyone in our unit." Captain Morrison wiped his eyes and returned to the table. "Walsh was a problem soldier. He showed disrespect for fallen comrades and made inappropriate jokes about casualties. We had to separate him from the unit because he was damaging morale. He saw my tattoo once when we were both at the base hospital," Sarah remembered. "I had injured my shoulder and the medic needed to examine my back. Walsh was there for a minor injury and saw it when the medic lifted my shirt." Lieutenant Barnes shook his head in disgust. "So he filed a false complaint against you because he was angry about being sent home early. He wanted to get revenge by damaging your military career." Colonel Henderson stood up and walked around the table to face Sarah directly. "Sergeant Martinez, I need to apologize to you on behalf of the entire military command. You should never have been subjected to this humiliation based on a false complaint." Sarah felt a mix of emotions flooding through her. Relief that the complaint was dismissed, anger at Walsh for filing false charges, and surprise at the emotional reactions of the 3 officers who had seen her tattoo. "The tattoo you carry on your back is not just beautiful artwork," Captain Morrison said, his voice still shaky with emotion. "It's a sacred memorial to heroes who gave their lives for their country. Those 43 names represent 43 families who lost sons, daughters, fathers, and mothers." Sarah had always known her tattoo was meaningful to her, but seeing the impact it had on these officers made her realize it was much more than personal art. It was a living memorial that honored the sacrifice of her fallen comrades. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Colonel Henderson picked up the complaint form and tore it in half. "Now we investigate Walsh for filing a false complaint, and we make sure this never happens to you again." The investigation into David Walsh's false complaint began immediately after Sarah left the meeting room. Colonel Henderson contacted the military police and requested a full review of the case. He also ordered that Sarah's personnel file be flagged to prevent any future harassment related to her memorial tattoo. Within hours, news of what had happened spread throughout the base. Soldiers who had served with Sarah began coming forward with their own stories about Walsh's inappropriate behavior during their deployment. The picture that emerged painted Walsh as a bitter and vindictive person who had held grudges against his former unit members. Sarah returned to her duties, trying to focus on her work, but she couldn't stop thinking about the morning's events. The emotional reactions of the 3 officers had deeply affected her. She had never realized that her tattoo could have such a powerful impact on other people who had shared similar experiences. During lunch break, Captain Morrison approached Sarah in the cafeteria. His eyes were still slightly red from earlier, but he seemed more composed now. He asked if he could sit with her, and Sarah nodded toward the empty chair across from her table. "I wanted to apologize for this morning," Captain Morrison said quietly. "The way we handled the situation was completely wrong. You should never have been put through that humiliation." Sarah took a sip of her coffee and looked at the captain thoughtfully. "You don't need to apologize. You were just following orders based on a complaint that was filed. You couldn't have known it was false." Captain Morrison shook his head. "But we should have handled it differently. We could have requested a female officer to conduct the inspection, or we could have investigated the complaint more thoroughly before ordering you to undress." Other soldiers in the cafeteria were stealing glances at their table. Word had gotten around about the morning's incident, and everyone seemed curious about what had really happened. Sarah noticed the whispered conversations and pointed looks. The whole base is talking about this, isn't it? Sarah asked. Captain Morrison nodded. News travels fast in a military environment. But I want you to know that everyone who has heard the real story is on your side. What you carry on your back is something to be proud of, not ashamed of. Lieutenant Barnes appeared at their table carrying his lunch tray. He asked if he could join them, and both Sarah and Captain Morrison agreed. The young officer looked much different than he had during the morning's tense meeting. I've been thinking about Fob Chapman all morning, Lieutenant Barnes said as he sat down. I never properly thanked you for saving my life that day during the mortar attack. Sarah felt uncomfortable with the praise. You don't need to thank me. We were all doing our jobs. Any soldier would have done the same thing. No, that's not true, Lieutenant Barnes insisted. Not every soldier would have risked their own life to drag a wounded comrade to safety, while explosions were going off all around them. You went above and beyond that day, Captain Morrison agreed. I remember treating your leg wound that day. You were lucky Sarah got you to cover when she did. A few more minutes in the open and you might not have survived. Sarah had tried not to think too much about her time in Afghanistan. The memories were painful and she preferred to focus on her current duties rather than dwelling on the past. But the morning's events had brought everything flooding back. The 43 names on your tattoo, Captain Morrison said carefully. I remember most of them. Rodriguez, Thompson, Williams, Chen, Jackson. They were all good soldiers who deserved better than what happened to them. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she heard the familiar names. Rodriguez was going to get married when he returned home. Thompson had a baby daughter he had never met. Williams was only 3 months away from completing his service. The three of them sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own memories of that difficult deployment. Other soldiers in the cafeteria continued their conversations around them, unaware of the heavy emotions at their table. Colonel Henderson appeared beside their table carrying an official-looking document. He had removed his hat, and his usually stern expression had been replaced with something much softer. I have an update on the Walsh investigation, Colonel Henderson announced as he sat down with them. We've discovered that this isn't the first false complaint he has filed against members of your former unit. Sarah's eyebrows raised in surprise. There have been others? 3 other soldiers from FOB Chapman have had complaints filed against them by Walsh over the past 2 years, Colonel Henderson explained. All of the complaints were eventually dismissed due to lack of evidence, but not before causing stress and embarrassment for the soldiers involved. Captain Morrison's jaw tightened with anger. So this has been an ongoing pattern of harassment? Colonel Henderson nodded grimly. It appears that Walsh has been systematically targeting members of his former unit as revenge for being sent home early. He's been trying to damage their military careers and reputations. Lieutenant Barnes slammed his fist on the table, causing other diners to look over at them. That's unacceptable. Those soldiers served with honor while Walsh was sent home in disgrace. The good news is that we now have enough evidence to court-martial Walsh for filing false complaints and harassment, Colonel Henderson continued. His military career is effectively over. Sarah felt a sense of relief knowing that Walsh would finally face consequences for his actions. But she also felt sad that his bitterness and resentment had led him down such a destructive path. What about the other soldiers he targeted? Sarah asked. Will they be notified that the complaints against them were part of this pattern of harassment? Colonel Henderson smiled for the first time that day. Actually, that brings me to some very good news. The military command has decided to formally recognize all of the soldiers who were targeted by Walsh's false complaints. You're all going to receive commendations for your service at FOB Chapman. Captain Morrison's eyes widened. That's wonderful news. These soldiers deserve to be recognized for their sacrifice and service. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. What had started as a humiliating experience was turning into recognition for her service and the memory of her fallen comrades. There's something else, Colonel Henderson added, looking directly at Sarah. The base commander wants to meet with you personally. He's very interested in hearing about your memorial tattoo and the story behind it. The next morning, Sarah stood outside the base commander's office feeling nervous about the upcoming meeting. She had never spoken directly with General Patricia Williams before, though she had seen her at various military ceremonies and events. The general had a reputation for being tough but fair, and Sarah wasn't sure what to expect from their conversation. The general's secretary, a friendly older woman named Mrs. Chen, smiled at Sarah and told her the general was ready to see her. Sarah knocked on the office door and heard a strong voice call for her to enter. General Williams stood up from behind her large wooden desk as Sarah entered the room. She was a tall woman with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and kind but serious eyes. The office walls were covered with military certificates, photographs, and awards from her distinguished career. "Please, sit down, Sergeant Martinez," General Williams said, gesturing toward a comfortable chair across from her desk. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." Sarah sat down carefully, maintaining proper military posture. She wasn't sure how to begin the conversation or what the general wanted to discuss with her. General Williams sat back down and opened a thick file folder on her desk. "I've been reading about yesterday's incident and the investigation into the false complaint filed against you. I want to start by apologizing for what you were put through." "Thank you, General. But the officers were just doing their duty based on the complaint they received," Sarah replied respectfully. "Perhaps the way the situation was handled could have been much better," General Williams said firmly. "We're implementing new procedures to prevent similar incidents in the future. No soldier should have to endure what you experienced." The general closed the file and looked directly at Sarah. "Colonel Henderson has told me about your memorial tattoo and its significance. I would be honored if you would share the story behind it with me." Sarah took a deep breath and began telling the general about her deployment to FOB Chapman. She described the close bonds she had formed with her fellow soldiers and the devastating losses they had suffered during their time in Afghanistan. As she spoke, she could see genuine emotion in the general's eyes. "The 43 soldiers memorialized in your tattoo represent the ultimate sacrifice for their country," General Williams said when Sarah finished her story. "Your decision to carry their memory with you in such a permanent way shows tremendous respect and love for your fallen comrades." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "They were more than just fellow soldiers, General. They were family. Some of them were just kids, barely out of high school. They all had dreams and plans for their lives after the military." General Williams stood up and walked to the window overlooking the base training grounds. Young soldiers were practicing drills in the morning sunshine, their voices carrying across the courtyard as they called out commands. "I lost soldiers under my command during my deployments too," General Williams said quietly. "The weight of their loss never leaves you. It becomes part of who you are as a soldier and as a person." The general returned to her desk and pulled out another folder. "I've been reviewing the service records of all 43 soldiers memorialized in your tattoo. Every single one of them was an exemplary soldier who served with distinction and honor." Sarah was surprised that the general had taken the time to research each of the fallen soldiers individually. It showed a level of care and attention that went beyond what she had expected. "I've made a decision about how our military community should respond to this situation," General Williams continued. "We're going to hold a special memorial ceremony to honor all 43 soldiers whose names you carry. Their families will be invited to attend." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. "General, that's incredibly generous, but I don't want to make a big spectacle out of this. My tattoo was meant to be a personal memorial." General Williams smiled warmly. "I understand your feelings, but these soldiers' sacrifice deserves public recognition. Their families need to know that they're loved, ones are not forgotten, and that fellow soldiers continue to honor their memory." The idea of a memorial ceremony was both exciting and terrifying for Sarah. She had never imagined that her personal tattoo would lead to such a significant event. "There's something else I want to discuss with you," General Williams said, opening yet another folder. "Your personnel file shows exceptional service throughout your military career. Your fellow soldiers speak highly of your leadership abilities and dedication." Sarah wondered where this conversation was heading. She had always tried to do her best work, but she didn't consider herself particularly exceptional compared to other soldiers. "I'm offering you the opportunity to attend Officer Candidate School," General Williams announced. "Your service record and the leadership you showed during your deployment make you an ideal candidate for a commission." Sarah felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Becoming an officer had always been a distant dream that she never thought was realistic for someone like her. "General, I'm honored by the offer, but I'm not sure I'm officer material," Sarah said hesitantly. General Williams laughed softly. "Sergeant Martinez, you carried wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. You've dedicated your career to serving others. You carry the memory of fallen comrades on your body as a permanent reminder of their sacrifice. If that's not officer material, I don't know what is. The general stood up and extended her hand to Sarah. You don't have to give me an answer today. Take some time to think about it and discuss it with people you trust. Sarah stood and shook the general's hand, still processing everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. What had started as a humiliating false complaint was turning into opportunities she had never imagined possible. Before you go, I have one more thing to tell you, General Williams said. The story of your memorial tattoo and the false complaint filed against you has reached the Pentagon. There are people in Washington who want to use your story to highlight the importance of honoring fallen soldiers and preventing harassment within the military. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the thought that her personal experience might have national implications. She had always preferred to serve quietly without drawing attention to herself. I know this is a lot to process, General Williams said understandingly, but sometimes individual acts of courage and dedication become symbols of something much larger. Your tattoo represents the love and respect that soldiers have for their fallen comrades. As Sarah left the general's office, her mind was spinning with possibilities and questions. The false complaint that had seemed like such a disaster was opening doors she had never expected to walk through. 3 weeks later, the military base was bustling with activity as preparations for the memorial ceremony reached their final stages. Sarah stood in her quarters looking at her dress uniform hanging on the closet door, feeling a mixture of pride and nervousness about the day ahead. The guest list for the ceremony had grown far beyond what anyone had originally expected. Family members of the 43 fallen soldiers were traveling from across the country to attend. Military officials from the Pentagon would be present, along with local government representatives and media outlets. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her mother calling from their hometown in Texas. News of the memorial ceremony had reached the local newspapers, and Sarah's family was incredibly proud of the honor being given to her and the fallen soldiers. Mija, your father and I are so proud of you, her mother said with emotion in her voice. What you've done to honor those soldiers is beautiful. Sarah smiled, feeling grateful for her family's support. I just hope the families of the fallen soldiers find some comfort in knowing their loved ones are remembered and honored. After ending the call with her mother, Sarah made her way to the ceremony staging area. The base chapel had been decorated with 43 individual memorial displays, each featuring a photograph of a fallen soldier along with information about their life and service. Captain Morrison approached Sarah as she reviewed the memorial displays. He looked sharp in his dress uniform, and she could see the same nervous energy in his eyes that she was feeling. The family started arriving this morning, Captain Morrison told her. I've spoken with several of them, and they're deeply moved by what you've done to honor their loved ones. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility for making sure the ceremony was meaningful for the grieving families. She had spent hours working with the chaplain and event organizers to ensure that each fallen soldier would be properly honored. Lieutenant Barnes joined them near the memorial display for Miguel Rodriguez. He was carrying a folder filled with photographs and documents related to the ceremony preparations. The media representatives are setting up their equipment, Lieutenant Barnes reported.
General Williams wants to make sure the story of this memorial reaches a wide audience. Sarah felt uncomfortable with the media attention.
But she understood that the ceremony was about more than just her personal tribute. It was an opportunity to educate the public about the sacrifices made by military families and the importance of supporting veterans. General Williams appeared beside them wearing her full dress uniform with all of her medals and decorations. She looked every inch the distinguished military leader, and Sarah felt honored to have her support for the memorial ceremony. The first family members are arriving at the chapel, General Williams announced. Sarah, I'd like you to personally greet each family if you're comfortable doing that. Sarah's stomach fluttered with nervousness, but she nodded her agreement. Meeting the families of the soldiers whose names were tattooed on her back would be both an honor and an emotional challenge. The first family to arrive was the Rodriguez family. Miguel's parents, Maria and Carlos, were accompanied by his younger sister, Elena, and his fiancée, Jessica. Sarah recognized them from photographs that Miguel had shown her during their deployment. Maria Rodriguez took Sarah's hands in hers and looked directly into her eyes. "Thank you for keeping my son's memory alive," she said in accented English, tears streaming down her face. "Knowing that a fellow soldier carries his name gives our family great comfort." Sarah felt her own tears starting to flow as she embraced Miguel's mother. "Miguel was like a brother to me. He talked about all of you constantly and couldn't wait to get home to marry Jessica." Jessica stepped forward and hugged Sarah tightly. "Miguel wrote about you in his letters home. He said you were one of the bravest soldiers he knew." The emotional meeting with Miguel's family set the tone for the rest of the family introductions. Each family had their own story of loss and grief, but they all expressed gratitude for Sarah's decision to memorialize their loved ones. The Thompson family arrived next. James Thompson's wife brought their daughter, who was now 5 years old but had never met her father. The little girl looked at Sarah with curious eyes and asked why everyone was crying. "We're crying because we miss your daddy, and all the other soldiers who went to heaven," Sarah explained gently to the child. "But they're happy tears because we're remembering all the good things about them." As more families arrived, the chapel filled with a mixture of grief and celebration. People shared stories about their fallen loved ones, and Sarah was amazed by the strength and resilience of the military families. Colonel Henderson approached Sarah with an official-looking document in his hands. "I have an update on the David Walsh court-martial," he said quietly. "He was found guilty of filing false complaints and harassment. He's been dishonorably discharged from the military." Sarah felt a sense of closure knowing that Walsh would face consequences for his actions. But more importantly, she was focused on ensuring that the memorial ceremony honored the fallen soldiers appropriately. The ceremony began with a military honor guard presenting the colors. General Williams delivered opening remarks about the importance of remembering fallen soldiers and supporting their families. The chaplain led prayers for the deceased and their families. Then it was Sarah's turn to speak. She walked to the podium feeling nervous but determined to honor her fallen comrades appropriately. Looking out at the audience, she saw the faces of grieving families mixed with proud military personnel. "The 43 soldiers we honor today were more than just names on a casualty list," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her emotions. "They were sons and daughters, husbands and wives, fathers and mothers. They were dreamers and jokers, leaders and followers. They were my family." Sarah spoke about specific memories of several soldiers, bringing laughter and tears from the audience as she shared stories about their personalities and quirks. She talked about Miguel's terrible jokes, Thompson's obsession with baseball statistics, and William's homesickness for his grandmother's cooking. "When I decided to get this tattoo, I wanted to make sure that these soldiers would never be forgotten," Sarah continued. "I never imagined that my personal memorial would lead to this beautiful ceremony, where all of their families could come together to honor their memory." As Sarah concluded her remarks, the entire audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. The sound of applause mixed with tears created an atmosphere of both celebration and mourning that perfectly captured the complexity of military loss. The memorial ceremony made national news within hours of its conclusion. Video footage of Sarah's speech and interviews with the families of fallen soldiers appeared on television networks across the country. Social media platforms buzzed with discussions about military sacrifice and the importance of honoring fallen heroes. Sarah's phone wouldn't stop ringing with interview requests from journalists, producers, and military organizations. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had always preferred to serve quietly, without public recognition. 2 days after the ceremony, Sarah received a phone call that would change her life forever. The caller introduced himself as Colonel David Patterson from the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office. "Sergeant Martinez, your story has captured the attention of the highest levels of military leadership," Colonel Patterson explained. "The Secretary of Defense would like to meet with you in Washington to discuss how your experience can help improve military policies regarding fallen soldier memorials and harassment prevention." Sarah sat down heavily in her chair, trying to process what she was hearing. The idea that her personal tattoo and the false complaint incident could influence national military policy seemed impossible to believe. "Colonel, I'm honored by the invitation, but I'm not sure what I could contribute to policy discussions," Sarah replied honestly. Colonel Patterson's voice was warm and encouraging. "Sometimes the most important perspectives come from soldiers who have lived through experiences that highlight problems in our current systems. Your story demonstrates both the power of honoring fallen comrades and the damage that false complaints can cause. The trip to Washington was arranged for the following week. Sarah would fly to the capital with General Williams, who had been asked to provide context about the base-level investigation and response to the incident. On the airplane to Washington, General Williams helped prepare Sarah for the meetings ahead. They reviewed talking points about the importance of memorial tattoos, the need for better complaint investigation procedures, and the value of supporting soldiers who had experienced combat losses. "Remember that you're not just representing yourself," General Williams advised. "You're speaking for all soldiers who have lost comrades and all military personnel who have faced false accusations." The Pentagon building was even more impressive than Sarah had imagined. The massive corridors filled with military personnel from all branches of service created an atmosphere of power and importance that made Sarah feel small and nervous. Their first meeting was with a committee of senior officers who were reviewing military policies related to tattoos and body art. Sarah explained how meaningful memorial tattoos could be for soldiers coping with loss, while also acknowledging the need for reasonable standards regarding visible tattoos. The current regulations focus mainly on preventing offensive or inappropriate tattoos, Sarah told the committee, but there should be specific protections for memorial tattoos that honor fallen service members. One committee member asked about the process Sarah had gone through to design her tattoo. She explained how she had worked with a military-friendly tattoo artist who specialized in memorial designs and had included input from other surviving members of her unit. The second meeting was with officials responsible for military justice and complaint procedures. Sarah described how the false complaint process had felt invasive and humiliating, particularly the immediate demand for her to undress without proper procedures or female supervision. "The current system seems to assume that complaints are valid and puts the burden on the accused soldier to prove their innocence," Sarah observed. "There should be preliminary investigation, procedures to verify complaints before subjecting soldiers to invasive inspections." The officials took detailed notes about Sarah's suggestions for improving the complaint investigation process. They seemed particularly interested in her ideas about mandatory preliminary reviews and requirements for same-gender supervision during any physical inspections. The highlight of the Washington trip was a meeting with Secretary of Defense Robert Harrison. Sarah had seen him on television and in newspapers, but meeting him in person was surreal. Secretary Harrison was a tall man with silver hair and kind eyes, who immediately put Sarah at ease with his informal conversational style. His office was filled with military memorabilia and photographs from his own distinguished service career. "Sergeant Martinez, your story has resonated with military families across the country," Secretary Harrison began. "The way you've honored your fallen comrades while handling false accusations with dignity has inspired many people." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the praise from such a high-ranking official. "Sir, I was just trying to serve my country and honor the memory of my friends. I never expected it to become such a public story." Secretary Harrison smiled. "Sometimes the most powerful stories come from ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Your decision to memorialize 43 fallen soldiers permanently on your body shows a level of commitment that goes beyond normal duty." The secretary explained that the Department of Defense was developing new policies based partly on Sarah's experience. These would include protections for memorial tattoos, improved complaint investigation procedures, and better training for officers handling sensitive personnel matters. "We're also creating a new program to help soldiers design and obtain memorial tattoos to honor fallen comrades," Secretary Harrison announced. "We'd like you to serve as an advisor for this program." Sarah was speechless. The idea that her personal memorial could lead to helping other soldiers honor their fallen friends was beyond anything she had imagined possible. "There's one more thing I'd like to discuss with you," Secretary Harrison continued. "Your service record and the leadership you've shown throughout this experience make you an excellent candidate for accelerated promotion. We'd like to offer you direct commissioning as a lieutenant." The offer was even more generous than what General Williams had proposed. Direct commissioning would make Sarah an officer immediately, without requiring her to attend officer candidate school first. "Sir, I'm incredibly honored by all of these opportunities," Sarah said carefully, "but I need some time to consider how I can best serve while staying true to my original motivation, which was simply honoring my fallen friends." Secretary Harrison nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of thoughtful response I would expect from someone with your character. Take all the time you need to make the right decision for yourself and your continued service. As Sarah and General Williams prepared to return to their base, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few weeks. A false complaint that had initially seemed like a career-threatening disaster had become an opportunity to influence national military policy and help other soldiers honor their fallen comrades. 6 months after the memorial ceremony, Sarah stood in her new office at the Pentagon wearing the silver bars of a first lieutenant on her uniform. The decision to accept the direct commission had not been easy, but she realized that her new position would allow her to help other soldiers in ways that her previous role could not. The memorial tattoo support program that Sarah now directed had already helped over 200 soldiers across all military branches design and obtain tattoos honoring their fallen comrades. The program provided counseling support, connected soldiers with experienced military tattoo artists, and helped with the cost of meaningful memorial artwork. Sarah's assistant knocked on her office door and entered with a stack of applications from soldiers requesting assistance with memorial tattoos. Each application told a story of loss and the desire to honor fallen friends, and Sarah read every one personally. One application particularly caught her attention. It was from a young Marine named Corporal Jennifer Walsh, who had lost 3 members of her unit in Iraq. Sarah noticed the last name and wondered if there could be any connection to David Walsh, the soldier who had filed the false complaint against her. After reviewing Jennifer's service record and the details of her request, Sarah discovered that Jennifer was indeed David Walsh's younger sister. The irony was not lost on Sarah that the sister of the man who had tried to damage her career was now seeking help from the program that had resulted from his false complaint. Sarah decided to personally review Jennifer's case. The young Marine had served with distinction in Iraq and had experienced significant trauma from losing her close friends in an IED explosion. Her request for a memorial tattoo was heartfelt and detailed, showing genuine love and respect for her fallen comrades. The question facing Sarah was whether to treat Jennifer's application differently because of her relationship to David Walsh. After much consideration, Sarah realized that Jennifer should not be penalized for her brother's poor choices and misconduct. Sarah called Jennifer directly to discuss her application. The conversation was emotional as Jennifer described her losses and her desire to honor her fallen friends. Toward the end of the call, Jennifer mentioned her brother's dishonorable discharge and expressed shame about his actions. "Lieutenant Martinez, I want you to know that my family was horrified when we learned what David did to you," Jennifer said with obvious pain in her voice. "His false complaint and harassment were completely wrong, and we don't support his actions." Sarah felt moved by Jennifer's honesty and courage in addressing her brother's misconduct. "Corporal Walsh, you are not responsible for your brother's choices. Your service record and the love you show for your fallen comrades are what matter for this program." The Memorial Tattoo Support Program approved Jennifer's application, and Sarah personally worked with her to design a meaningful tribute to her 3 fallen friends. The tattoo featured their names surrounded by Marine Corps symbols and a quote about brotherhood that had special meaning for their unit. As the program continued to grow, Sarah received regular updates about its impact on military morale and mental health. Soldiers who participated in the program reported feeling better connected to their fallen comrades and more supported in their grief processing. General Williams visited Sarah's Pentagon office to discuss the broader policy changes that had resulted from her original experience. The new complaint investigation procedures had significantly reduced false accusations while ensuring that legitimate complaints were handled properly and sensitively. "The changes you've helped implement are making a real difference throughout the military," General Williams told Sarah. "False complaint rates have dropped by 60% since the new procedures were implemented." Sarah felt proud that her difficult experience had led to positive changes that protected other soldiers from similar harassment. The preliminary investigation requirements and mandatory same-gender supervision protocols were preventing the kind of humiliation she had experienced. The military tattoo regulations had also been updated to specifically protect memorial tattoos honoring fallen service members. Soldiers could no longer be disciplined or harassed for tattoos that appropriately memorialized deceased comrades, as long as the artwork met basic decency standards. 1 year after accepting her commission, Sarah received a letter from Maria Rodriguez, Miguel's mother. The letter contained photographs from a family gathering where Miguel's nieces and nephews had learned about their uncle's military service and sacrifice. "Dear Lieutenant Martinez," the letter read, "Our family wanted you to know that Miguel's memory lives on not just in your tattoo, but in the hearts of a new generation. His nieces and nephews now understand what their uncle did for his country, and they are proud to be part of a military family." The letter continued with updates about other family members and their appreciation for the memorial ceremony that had brought together families from across the country. Many of the families had stayed in touch with each other, creating a support network for military families who had experienced loss. Sarah kept the letter in her desk drawer, along with similar messages from other families whose loved ones were memorialized in her tattoo. These letters reminded her daily of the real purpose behind her work and the importance of honoring fallen soldiers. As she prepared to leave her office that evening, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point. A false complaint that had initially seemed like a disaster had become the catalyst for meaningful changes in military policy and support for grieving soldiers. The tattoo on her back still carried the names of 43 fallen comrades, but now it represented something larger than personal memorial. It had become a symbol of the military's commitment to honoring fallen heroes and protecting soldiers from harassment and false accusations. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Morrison, who was now serving at a base in Germany. The message included a photo of a young soldier showing off a new memorial tattoo honoring his fallen squad leader, with a note that read, "Another soldier helped by your program. The ripple effects of your courage continue to spread." Looking out her office window at the lights of Washington, Sarah felt grateful for the opportunity to serve in a way that honored both her fallen friends and the living soldiers who continued to serve despite the risks and sacrifices involved. Her story had begun with an order to remove her uniform, but it had evolved into a mission to ensure that fallen soldiers would never be forgotten and that living soldiers would be protected from those who would abuse the military justice system. The 43 names on her back would always remind her of the ultimate sacrifice made by her friends, but now they also represented hope for positive change and the power of one person's courage to make a difference in the lives of many others.